Hey, so at the time of filming, I'm a day or two out from the first Perform Better summit that we had in Orlando. And just given what I talked about in my talk, but also some of the new setups that is part of the summit, where one of the lanes, many of you know there'd be 4 lanes, 2 speakers in doing the lecture and 2 speakers doing hands-on. Now there's a 5th lane where 2 or 3 speakers have their own little room and you get to sit at a table and basically just ask anything. And I'm okay with everything I said, but it's probably a little bit more liberal in my mouth than what I would say online. So a lot of really good things came out of it. And as a combination, because of course most of the things people are asking are related to the talk, but the big piece in terms of how do we appreciate connective tissue, of which muscle is one, but within that connective tissue, there's components that contract, and then there's components that don't contract. And even if you go to the most recent reel where I'm wearing that beautiful purple Nike golf shirt, there's a difference in terms of what the different components I think are doing, and then the protocols or the training environments to create adaptations in the part of the muscle that contracts is different than the part of the muscle that doesn't contract. Additionally, those are 2 different versions of strong, because I think when you create adaptations in each of those different components, something very, very good happens that's very, very similar. But we do need to answer some of the questions as to how sometimes certain individuals can't lift their way out of a paper bag, but yet can create incredible amounts of force at certain times. In a similar situation, not necessarily what we're talking about here, you have other groups of individuals that can't lift their way out of a paper bag, but can create incredible power. And maybe we'll do another video to describe those differences. So now you might be really, really strong to lift weights. You might be really, really strong to control your body, which I will compartmentalize as not creating force, but resisting force. You might be really, really strong as a word of superlative, not talking about how hard you can contract a muscle, meaning you're really, really good at using your muscles and tendons and brain to be really, really fast. Those are all very, very different components of strong. You might also find the different implements that you use that weigh something different on a scale, but have a very, very different rate of perceived exertion. AKA, if you use a barbell that lives within your base of support, like putting it on your back, you can squat, and many people have squatted well over 1,000 pounds. I'm very confident that that same individual is completely incapable of holding 2 500-pound kettlebells in the rack position, if such a silly thing even existed. They can't even hold 250. They can hold 106-pound kettlebells. And that's 20%. And what's interesting is if you check what the force plate is saying, there's not a 20% difference. So there's a whole nother version of strong when you include load carriage and what the body is actually required to do when you carriage load that is slightly outside of your base of support. No differently than if you take a 5-pound dumbbell, which is way harder to hold out here than it is in here. So there's lots of different ways to define strong, okay? And I think it's a very, very worthy discussion, because the first thing I think of if someone's strong is if they can create force, meaning they can lift something that's relatively static and get it moving. That's starting strength, and not to be confused with a commercial brand, which actually makes a lot of sense. But overcoming inertia and then you applying all these different laws of physics, you'll find that different situations ask for different protocols to create different adaptations, all of which can translate to strong. Now, what we're going to do now is maybe just use the rotator cuff as an example, because this really not only makes a lot of sense given what the rotator cuff is and what it isn't, but also will tie into what we just saw on the 3rd mini seminar that was released, the free mini seminar that if you're not on the T equals R shoulder list at the time of filming here, you missed it. I imagine if you're watching this way, way down the road, I tend to think those mini seminars might be available in a different format, but we'll see. We'll see. So let's talk about the rotator cuff. And I actually, with one of my patients this morning, I said, because I believe he has a rotator cuff tear. I don't believe it's significant, but we are going to get the MRI because that's what we need to do. We're going to control the information in the MRI, like we seem to talk about almost on every case study here. But I explained that, as we look at the anatomy and appreciate what is the anatomy and what we think is going on, because all we can do is just think, and we can maybe be right, but if we don't have the imaging, we don't know, that you don't typically see the muscles of the rotator cuff tear. Maybe if you unfortunately took a knife and somebody got you from behind, then you could have a tear through the infraspinatus. But when we look at these chronic overload situations, we do not typically see the muscles tearing. We see the tendons tearing. He talks about having pain here, where a lot of lay folks will actually think, because of this circular convexity here at the bottom of the deltoid, they think that's the rotator cuff, because when they have a shoulder injury and it hurts here, that makes sense to them. Well, we know the rotator cuff tendons live up here, and they dive under this bone right here, and they live largely in the back, and maybe if we would say the armpit is the front, but it's still in the back because you can't touch the subscapularis there. This pain is referred, and it may also be somewhat of an overload of the deltoid, which you do not ever really see tears. Just given the shape of the deltoid, you don't see a lot of deltoid tears. I'm pretty sure I've never seen any. It's a very similar shape, or the correct word to describe the shape of a muscle would be pennation. The glute medius is very similar, and you will at times see glute medius tears from these overload situations, but you don't seem to really see the deltoid. So if the person can acknowledge that it's not their deltoid that is torn, then it may not be the problem, okay? What can you see here? You can see some bursitis at this attachment of the deltoid, but that's a little bit more focal, and it's not necessarily associated with these other types of rotator cuff issues, okay? Now, by and large, when we look at the physics of muscles contract to create force, the tendon transmits the force. So you can never transmit force through the tendon without a muscle. That's not possible. Or with maybe somebody you are pulling the muscle externally, maybe with electric stim or something like that. But the goal of the force created by the muscle to go through the tendon that attaches to the bone is to move the bone. So overall, in a large scheme of how you can compartmentalize where you're trying to create adaptations, if you move fairly slowly and maybe with less weight, even to higher weight, you'll focus more on the muscle. But if you need to move very, very fast, you might be focusing more on the tendon. And you'll focus more on the tendon when you move fast, when the muscle is slacked. Okay? We've talked about that in other joints as you focus on like the patellar tendon or the Achilles tendon. So the rotator cuff tendon isn't different. So we have lots of maybe what we think are tried and true tendon protocols for the knee and the ankle, but we don't seem to apply the same overall strategies to the shoulder, and I think we should. Now, if we're looking to create changes in the tendon of the rotator cuff, which is really where the problems are, and remember, we don't need the muscle of the rotator cuff to be very, very strong. We need it to just work together with others, and we don't need a high percentage of MVIC, max volitional contraction. What we need is for the tendon to be ideally aligned for where it is you want to be explosive, and we need the tendon to be as robust and intact and directionally aligned, as I just mentioned, to where it attaches to the shoulder. If it's torn, we need it to get untorn. We need it to be put back together. So there are positions on MRI, if we know one tendon is compromised but not another, we can create angles of where the shoulder and the scapula are positioned and maximally stretch up to pain. Now, when you are treating a tendon, I think there is some reason that the research would tell us that you can deal with some pain, maybe a 3 or a 4 out of 10. And ideally, we start isometrics, but we have to get long. We have to get as long as possible to create the signal of beginning an environment of hypoxia. Just pulling something, in theory, will start to create some hypoxia if you hold it there long term. And we are angling towards the literature that would support why longer-term isometrics seem to be very, very effective in all forms of connective tissue. So the only difference of how we would treat a tendon versus treat a muscle or a muscle tear, muscle pull, muscle strain, these are all the same things. We would then change the angle of slack so that we would then create more length in the muscle. So the hypoxic environment goes to the muscle, or is created in the muscle. So the adaptation of transcribing new collagen goes to where it's long. I think that's what's happening when you try to put together, because it's never in one research article, it's never in one study, it's never in one construct of physics and biology. I try to take this one and maybe put it here, that doesn't make sense. What if you move it around this way? So we need to create length.